On a frigid October morning, inside the high-security Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, a billionaire music mogul sat in a cell no bigger than a walk-in closet. Gone were the velvet suits, the Grammys, the private jets. What remained was a man stripped of empire, stripped of image, and now stripped of freedom. Sean "Diddy" Combs had just been found guilty of transporting individuals across state lines to engage in prostitution charges brought under the century-old Mann Act. But this wasn't just about federal code violations or obscure legal technicalities. This was about something darker, deeper, a system, a structure, a kingdom built behind soundproof hotel walls, ruled by a man who allegedly demanded loyalty, silence, and submission. 11 months after his arrest, Diddy's attorneys submitted an urgent motion: release him immediately. They argued the conviction was unjust, rooted in outdated laws that criminalized consensual adult behavior. They pointed to the exceptional conditions inside MDC: violence, threats, medical neglect. They painted him as a non-violent, cooperative defendant, a father, a man trying to reclaim dignity before sentencing. But outside that courtroom, the world wasn't so sure. The trial had unearthed a disturbing trove of testimonies: hotel surveillance showing physical assault, witnesses describing ritualistic sex events dubbed freakoffs, long-term girlfriends recounting psychological manipulation, forced drug use, and being turned into performance objects under Diddy's control. There were rumors long dismissed as urban myth that suddenly found legs in sworn testimony: Molotov cocktails, hidden cameras, bribes, and a mansion empire protected not just by money, but by fear. And then there was Cassie Ventura, the woman at the center of it all. Pregnant, exhausted, and under oath peeling back the curtain on a relationship that, to the public, once looked like tabloid glamour. But in court, it was revealed as a 2-decade cycle of coercion, surveillance, humiliation, and alleged sexual violence. If her story is true, then the charges Diddy now faces, however narrow, are only the surface of a much deeper rot. If it's not true, then we are witnessing one of the most high-profile character assassinations in recent memory. So what really happened behind those velvet curtains when the music stopped and the doors were locked? And is this trial about justice or just revenge? Sean John Combs, better known to the world as Puff Daddy, P. Diddy, or simply Diddy, is not just a name, he is a brand, a living icon. From Harlem hustler to hip-hop billionaire, his life has been a calculated ascent through music, fashion, nightlife, and influence. But behind the glossy magazine, covers, and platinum records lies a man whose rise to power was not just meteoric, it was total. Born in 1969, Diddy came of age in a post-civil rights America that was still riddled with racial glass ceilings. His father, Melvin Combs, was murdered when Diddy was just 2. The void left behind became both his wound and his engine. Raised by a single mother in Mount Vernon, he would later describe his childhood as hungry for wealth, for respect, for control. That hunger translated into ambition. By his 20s, he was already a major force in the music industry, launching the careers of legends like the Notorious Big and Mary J. Blige. He founded Bad Boy Records, Sean John Clothing, and Ciroc Vodka, all under a persona that was part mogul, part myth. But even in his earliest business dealings, there were whispers, intimidation tactics, temper tantrums, a ruthless need to dominate every room. To his fans, he was the ultimate entertainer. To his detractors, he was a manipulative narcissist with a messiah complex. The line between man and image began to blur. Employees reportedly called him the king behind closed doors, not as a joke, but as a warning. Assistants were expected to anticipate his needs before he voiced them. Women were expected to submit. Control wasn't just a preference, it was protocol. His romantic relationships followed a similar pattern: secrecy, power imbalance, intensity. He was frequently linked to models and singers, but it was his decade-long on and off relationship with Cassie Ventura that would ultimately bring him to trial. What looked like a star-studded pairing in public allegedly hid a nightmare of gaslighting, forced submission, and sexual degradation. Multiple witnesses, including Diddy's former assistants and security team, would later testify to a dual personality, a man who could be generous, charismatic, and warm one minute, and explosively violent the next. Friends say he lived in extremes: opulence and paranoia, generosity and cruelty, ecstasy and rage. And then there was the sex, what Diddy called a lifestyle. Others described as performance-based coercion, allegedly orchestrating encounters that blurred the line between kink and abuse, where partners were watched, filmed, and manipulated under the pretense of love, or worse, loyalty. But perhaps the most chilling part of his profile is this: Diddy wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was everywhere. Front row at Fashion Week, on stage at the Grammys, delivering commencement speeches, all while, according to prosecutors, running what amounted to a closed-loop system of exploitation where employees, girlfriends, and business partners either enabled the behavior or remained silent out of fear. So, who is Sean Combs, really? A product of trauma and survival, whose need for control was forged in grief and ambition? Or a master manipulator who weaponized fame, money, and charm to build a kingdom no one dared to question? The first hint that something was wrong came not from the headlines, but from silence. Silence in hallways, silence in hotel suites, silence in the eyes of women who had everything on paper: beauty, fame, luxury, but walked like they were being watched. The allegations against Sean Combs didn't explode all at once. They bled out slowly, over years. Then came November 2023. Cassie Ventura, his longtime girlfriend and former artist, filed a civil lawsuit that cracked the dam wide open. Within weeks, new plaintiffs emerged. By spring of 2024, federal charges followed. But what made this case so disturbing wasn't just the charges, it was the pattern. Prosecutors described what they called a closed-loop abuse system, a structure of control, concealment, and psychological warfare, masked behind private jets and designer parties. They weren't describing random outbursts or isolated incidents. They were describing a machine. At the center of it all were the freakoff's pre-scheduled sexual sessions allegedly orchestrated by Combs, involving Cassie, male escorts, porn actors, and sometimes multiple observers. These weren't casual threesomes. According to multiple witnesses, they were ritualized performances, arranged like theater. Lighting, costumes, drugs, instructions. Escort Daniel Phillip told the court he was hired under the pretense of a private party. What he found was a candlelit suite, Cassie in red lingerie, and Combs hooded, silent in a corner, filming. Later, Combs took a photo of his driver's license. Just insurance, he allegedly said. Phillip described one session where Combs, enraged that Cassie didn't respond quickly enough to his command, hurled a liquor bottle across the room, dragged her by the hair into a bedroom, and re-emerged calm, asking, "Y'all ready to continue?" Others painted even darker scenes. Cassie testified she was urinated on, choked, and forced to participate while menstruating. She said she disassociated during sessions, numbed by drugs provided by Combs himself. She said it wasn't intimacy, it was performance, and it wasn't optional. She wasn't alone. Former assistant David James described how he was ordered to prep sweets in advance: candles, drinks, condoms, baby oil. He claimed Combs once told him, "If she doesn't listen, make her." Another assistant testified to being forced to take lie detector tests after a blog post hinted at abuse. A missing Cartier bracelet led to hotel room raids. It wasn't just Cassie who lived in fear. Carrie Morgan, her close friend, testified that she, too, was assaulted by Combs in 2018. Former Danity Kane singer Dawn Richard spoke of witnessing Combs punch Cassie in the stomach at a celebrity dinner usher in New York, allegedly in attendance, and then choke her in the car ride home. She described a culture of submission where even questioning the abuse risked career death. "You're here to work," Combs allegedly told her. "Stop, or you'll pay for it." Then came the physical evidence. A hotel surveillance video from 2016. It showed Combs attacking Cassie in a Los Angeles hotel. When security responded, Combs allegedly tried to bribe the officer with cash. "Don't tell anyone," he said. Witness after witness described the same traits: the mood swings, the violent control, the obsession with dominance. Even male victims came forward. Shirai Hayes, a former exotic dancer, recalled being hired by Cassie, then realizing it was a setup. Combs sat silently in the corner. Hayes was paid in cash. The sessions repeated. It was performance art, he said. Except we weren't acting. We were surviving. Kid Cudi's testimony hit like a detonation. In 2011, he had a brief relationship with Cassie. When Combs found out, Cudi's home was broken into. Weeks later, his Porsche was firebombed. Flames gutted the interior. Surveillance footage was erased. When they finally met face to face, Cudi asked Combs about the car. Combs allegedly replied, "I don't know what you're talking about." Years later, he apologized for everything. What prosecutors argued was clear. This was not a man with a bad temper. This was a leader of an abusive enterprise, aided by a network of loyalists and fear. A man who treated violence as a tool, sex as a weapon, silence as currency. Combs' defense team, of course, denied it all. They called it adult relationships gone messy. They admitted to a swinger lifestyle, to drugs, to power games, but said none of it was criminal, just unusual. But federal prosecutors disagreed. They brought 5 charges against him: racketeering, sex trafficking, and violations of the Mann Act. The racketeering and trafficking counts didn't stick. The jury wasn't convinced that force or fraud had been used to compel sex acts. But the Mann Act convictions remained. 2 counts: transportation for prostitution. Combs' team argued that the Mann Act was outdated, rooted in racism and moral panic, that it was never meant for situations involving consensual adults. But the prosecution wasn't asking the jury to judge his kinks. They were asking whether he used his money, his status, and his infrastructure to coerce, surveil, and degrade, to transport, to silence, and whether he believed he was untouchable. Because if all of this is true, then Sean Combs didn't just build a music empire. He built a dungeon. And for over a decade, the doors stayed shut. For years, the rumors swirled like smoke, thick, suffocating, but never quite catching fire. Whispers of abuse, control, sexual coercion, and violence followed Sean Combs for nearly a decade. But without hard evidence or formal accusations, they remained just that, whispers. That changed in November 2023. Cassie Ventura, after over a decade of silence, filed a civil lawsuit in New York. The 35-page complaint detailed years of physical abuse, drug-fueled sexual coercion, and an alleged pattern of surveillance, intimidation, and psychological control. Her testimony didn't just paint Diddy as controlling, it described a man who had systematically stripped away her autonomy, both emotionally and professionally. It was the crack that broke the dam. Within weeks, several other women stepped forward with eerily similar stories. Civil suits turned into affidavits. Then came sealed warrants. By early 2024, the Department of Justice had opened a criminal investigation. What investigators uncovered would send shockwaves through the industry. Bank records were subpoenaed. Phone metadata was analyzed. Former assistants, bodyguards, and sex workers were quietly interviewed across multiple jurisdictions: Los Angeles, Miami, New York. Prosecutors found flight logs, hotel bookings under aliases, and encrypted messaging apps used by Combs' staff. A financial trail began to emerge. Payments to agencies, escort services, and direct cash transfers labeled as consulting or client bonuses. The FBI took particular interest in his use of private jets. Over a dozen flights were traced between 2018 and 2023, each carrying the same small circle of women: Cassie, Jane Doe, and multiple male escorts. Prosecutors alleged that these flights, often booked through shell companies, violated the Mann Act, transporting individuals across state lines for illicit sexual activity. In September 2024, a sealed indictment was unsealed. Combs was arrested in Los Angeles and flown to New York in federal custody. The charges were serious: racketeering, RICO, sex trafficking of 2 individuals, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, 2 counts of Mann Act violations. The legal strategy was bold. Prosecutors weren't just painting Combs as an abuser. They were framing him as the head of a criminal enterprise, similar to how mob bosses and drug lords had been prosecuted. But Combs had prepared for war. He retained a legal team of high-profile defense attorneys known for their work in federal white-collar crime. Almost immediately, they moved to have the case dismissed on constitutional grounds, citing misuse of the Mann Act. racial targeting, and overreach. Those motions were denied. In May 2025, the trial officially began. From the beginning, jury selection was contentious. Due to the high-profile nature of the case, jurors were kept anonymous, each one vetted with extraordinary scrutiny. Would they be influenced by the headlines, the fame, the power? Opening statements revealed the chasm between prosecution and defense. Federal attorneys argued this was about power and pattern, that Combs used his wealth and influence to isolate, coerce, and control. That this wasn't about consensual adult behavior, but about grooming, dependency, and emotional captivity. The defense painted a different picture. Adult relationships gone sour. They admitted to the drugs, the unusual sex life, even the volatile temper. But they insisted that nothing rose to the level of criminality, that these were kinks, not crimes, that Cassie and others had participated willingly, even enthusiastically. They challenged the credibility of witnesses, raised questions about timing, suggested ulterior motives, money, revenge, fame. But the prosecution had one powerful tool on their side: corroboration. Witnesses who had never met told eerily similar stories. Timelines matched. Physical evidence, hotel logs, text messages, financial transfers backed the narratives. The video from 2016 showing Combs assaulting Cassie at a hotel became a devastating centerpiece. The trial dragged on for weeks, and when the verdict finally came, it was a legal split. Not guilty on racketeering, not guilty on sex trafficking, guilty on 2 counts under the Mann Act. The judge ordered Combs to remain in custody until sentencing. But even as he awaited his fate, his legal team filed a motion demanding immediate release, arguing that the charges he was convicted of were outdated, inconsistent with DOJ policy, and that his detention was unfair, given the conditions at MDC. The motion is still pending, but one thing is now undeniable. The kingdom of Sean Combs has been cracked open. And for the first time, the man who once stood untouchable at the summit of culture is now being studied under the harshest light of all: criminal law. The federal courthouse in Manhattan had seen its share of high-profile trials, but nothing quite like this. For weeks, the press camped outside in shifts. Satellite vans lined the block. Spectators formed queues before sunrise. Inside, however, it was near silence. A courtroom transformed into a pressure cooker, boiling slowly under the weight of testimonies, trauma, and the quiet calculations of a jury. The People versus Sean John Combs opened not with scandalous headlines or celebrity cameos, but with a single statement from the prosecution. This case is not about sex, it's about power. It was an all-female team of federal prosecutors. They moved with surgical precision, methodical, composed, unflinching. Their opening argument painted Diddy not as a man with dark tastes, but as an architect of submission. They detailed the structure: inner circle employees, ritualized abuse sessions, financial manipulation, and emotional captivity. But perhaps their sharpest tool wasn't in evidence, it was their witnesses. First came the men, the ones hired to perform, escorts who described candlelit freakoffs, orchestrated like choreography. One by one, they testified that the sex wasn't just performative, it was directed. And in the shadows, always watching, was Combs. Hooded, silent, filming. Then came the women. Cassie Ventura took the stand, 8 months pregnant, her hands trembling as she recalled years of training. Her word, not the prosecution's. She described being instructed when to smile, when to speak, how to behave, how to breathe. The freak-offs, she said, weren't about pleasure. They were about obedience. I was an object, she told the court, and I learned to act like one. She recounted being urinated on, filmed without consent, stripped of access to her bank accounts and her phone. Her career stalled, her movements monitored, her body not her own. One moment hung heavy over the room, the time she choked on bodily fluid and raised her hand in panic. Combs allegedly watched in silence before finally telling the man to stop. The defense didn't flinch. They met her account head-on, armed with old text messages and emails. They projected onto a courtroom screen messages Cassie had sent to Diddy. Wish we could have freaked off before you left. Always ready for you. Under cross-examination, she acknowledged the messages, but she clarified. That's what survival looked like. Then came Kid Cudi. His presence changed the room. Not just because of who he was, but because of what he confirmed, that his Porsche had been firebombed after Diddy discovered his relationship with Cassie. Cudi recounted walking into a hotel suite, confronting Combs and asking, "Did you do it?" Diddy allegedly replied, "I don't know what you're talking about." But years later, he apologized. Other witnesses followed. Assistants, former friends, fellow artists. Some spoke of bruises covered in makeup, others of being warned not to speak. Many described a culture of complicity where silence was currency, and truth came with a price. Still, the defense dug in. They portrayed Diddy as flawed but human, a man with kinks, not crimes, a temper, not terror. They emphasized the Mann Act's archaic origins, suggesting it had no place in a modern trial about adult relationships. Then came the turning point. Surveillance footage from 2016 showed Diddy attacking Cassie in a hotel hallway. No sound, just violence. It was grainy but unmistakable. That, the prosecution said, is the truth without spin. In closing arguments, they left the jury with this: he built a kingdom where pain was the currency and control was the crown. The defense countered, "This is not a criminal trial. This is a breakup on trial." On the 2nd of July, 2025, the verdict came in. Not guilty on racketeering, not guilty on sex trafficking, guilty on 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution under the Mann Act. The courtroom didn't erupt. It exhaled. Combs sat still. No reaction, no words. Just the quiet rustle of papers as his lawyers prepared an immediate motion for release. The judge denied bail. He would remain in custody, awaiting sentencing in October. But the question whispered through the courthouse corridors that day wasn't just about time served. It was this: did justice win? Or did power just retreat into the shadows, waiting? To understand Sean Diddy Combs, one must separate the performer from the machine, the man from the myth, and then ask, was the monster born or built? For decades, Combs played both parts. The icon, the mogul draped in silk and Ciroc, photographed with presidents, worshipped by millions. And then, the alleged predator, the man behind locked hotel doors, engineering encounters with eerie precision. These dualities aren't coincidental. They are textbook. Forensic psychologists examining the trial have drawn parallels between Combs and archetypes of coercive control personalities, individuals who build entire environments to dominate others emotionally, financially, sexually, and psychologically. It's not about sudden violence. It's about sustained influence. Cassie Ventura described their relationship as training. That word isn't just emotional. It's behavioral science. Victims of coercive control often develop learned helplessness, where resistance fades not because they agree, but because they stop believing escape is possible. In this framework, Combs' behavior fits a clear pattern: isolation, restricting Cassie's communications, travel, and even finances; surveillance, watching, filming, collecting data on participants, sometimes photographing IDs or tracking movements; humiliation, using sex acts, urination, and degradation, not for pleasure, but for psychological dominance; reward and punishment, granting access to career opportunities or taking them away; providing luxury, then revoking it as discipline. But is that enough to diagnose him? Some experts suggest traits of narcissistic personality disorder, particularly the malignant subtype where charm masks an intense need for control, and those around them are treated as tools rather than people. The lavish gifting, the public affection, the intense private rage, it all forms a cycle. Idealize, devalue, discard. Others point to paranoid tendencies. Testimony from former assistants and bodyguards confirmed Diddy's deep distrust of his own staff. Lie detector tests, raiding hotel rooms, obsessive control over photos, videos, even the scent in hotel suites. The world outside, it seemed, was a threat to be preemptively neutralized. Still, one must ask, what forged that mindset? Diddy's father was murdered when he was just 2 years old, reportedly involved in the drug trade. Raised in Harlem and Mount Vernon, he grew up witnessing how power worked on the streets. Silence kept you alive. Control kept you respected. Losing control meant losing everything. What began as survival may have metastasized into obsession. Power, once acquired, had to be rehearsed, reasserted, reperformed. This is perhaps why freakoffs weren't spontaneous. They were rehearsed, directed, filmed, not simply acts of indulgence, but rituals of command. Every participant's role carefully staged, every deviation punished. There's also the question of identity. Sean Combs wasn't just a man, he was a brand. Diddy was a performance of masculinity, wealth, dominance, and sexual conquest. In that performance, vulnerability was unacceptable. Loss was unthinkable. So when women like Cassie developed autonomy, or worse, dared to leave it, wasn't heartbreak, it was betrayal. And betrayal, to someone like Combs, required punishment. What's most unsettling is how long this allegedly continued without consequence. People knew. People around him watched. Some were silent out of fear. Others perhaps rationalized what they saw as eccentricity. He's just intense. That's just Diddy. But as Don Richards said on the stand, we all knew. We just didn't think we could say anything and survive it. This is where the conversation leaves psychology and enters society. How many empires are built on silence? How many celebrities are protected by the very fame that should hold them accountable? Combs is not the first powerful man to face such accusations, but his case reintroduces an uncomfortable truth, that when enough money, charm, and access converge, abuse can masquerade as lifestyle, and the line between consent and compliance becomes dangerously blurred. Whether Sean Combs is a sociopath, a traumatized child who grew into a controlling man, or a combination of both, is something experts will debate for years. But in the courtroom, the labels didn't matter. What mattered was the impact. And in the wreckage left behind testimonies, trauma, and lives rearranged, there's a chilling question echoing across industries, fandoms, and boardrooms. If this was the system Diddy built, who else has one just like it? Sean Combs now sits in the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, awaiting sentencing scheduled for the 3rd of October, 2025. At the time of this writing, his legal team is making one final push for immediate release, arguing that the Mann Act convictions are outdated, the charges are inconsistent with federal policy, and that his incarceration is unjustified, given the prison's dangerous conditions. The court has yet to rule on the motion, but one thing is clear: the damage is done. Combs may not face a life sentence. Legal analysts predict a sentencing range of 2 to 5 years, possibly with credit for time served. Some argue he may be out within a year. Others believe the judge will use this moment to send a message not just to Combs, but to the entire ecosystem that enabled him. But beyond the walls of the courthouse, something larger is unfolding. Diddy's name is being removed from awards. Radio stations have pulled his music. Fashion brands and liquor companies have paused or severed ties. Once the embodiment of 2000's second-era opulence, he's now a symbol of something else entirely. Unchecked power turned inward, and the ripple effects are far from over. More alleged victims are reportedly consulting with attorneys. Several of Combs' former employees, once silenced by NDAs and fear, are beginning to speak out anonymously. Industry insiders are calling this the Harvey Weinstein moment for hip-hop, a cultural reckoning decades in the making. But not everyone agrees. Some argue that prosecuting a black mogul for consensual adult sex under a century-old statute is selective justice, especially when similar cases involving white executives never made it past the civil courts. Others say the trial blurred too many lines between morality and legality, between lifestyle and crime. And that debate is precisely what makes this case so divisive. Is this justice finally catching up to privilege? Or is it a cautionary tale of retroactive moral policing? Cassie Ventura, now a mother and public survivor, has chosen silence since the verdict. Her attorneys have said she will not give further interviews. But her testimony stands as the cornerstone of this entire trial, a woman once voiceless, now heard. For Sean Combs, the road ahead is uncertain. Appeals may follow. Rebranding is inevitable. But redemption? That's something even his money can't buy. As the music fades and the lights dim, we're left with no soundtrack, only a question. Was this a fall from grace? Or the first time the world saw him without the mask? Because sometimes justice doesn't come with a gavel. It comes with a voice that finally breaks the silence. And sometimes, that voice isn't asking for revenge. It's asking for recognition. What happens when power goes unchecked? The story of Sean Diddy Combs is more than a courtroom drama. It's a mirror held up to fame, to power, and to the people who protect it. For over a decade, the man behind multi-platinum records and billion-dollar brands allegedly built a system where silence was rewarded, obedience was demanded, and pain was routine. This isn't just about one man. It's about the culture that let him operate unchecked. Assistants, security guards, executives, they saw the signs. Many stayed silent, some stayed loyal. And that silence allowed the damage to spread. So here's the real question. How many more stories are we missing because we choose not to look? Fame should never be a shield from accountability. And money should never be a muzzle for the truth. If Cassie hadn't spoken up, would any of this have come to light? We want to hear from you. Do you believe justice was served in this case? Was this trial fair? Or did the system go too far? Let us know in the comments below. And if you think these conversations matter, don't forget to share this video. Because silence protects no one. But truth, that just might save someone else.